8 o'clock in the morning, 41st floor of the Rinaldi Holdings building, and Adeline Beckett was arranging the day's meetings when the door swung open and Massimo Rinaldi walked in with his tie loose, his coat over one arm, and the eyes of a man who had not slept at all. In his hand was a folder stamped by a law office. For 3 years he had said her name every single day, but this morning he stopped in the middle of the room and asked her, "You're Adeline, aren't you?" As though he were seeing for the first time the woman who had sat 12 steps from his desk all that while. He told her he needed a wife before 5 o'clock that evening. Not next week, not next month, 5 o'clock today, or he would lose control of the company, lose the ports, lose everything his grandfather had left behind. There was a clause in the family trust that the bank's attorney had sent notice of at 11 the night before. A clause he had always been certain would not concern him for another 6 years. He offered her $2 million and an apartment in Lincoln Park, and he said it in the voice of a man who already knew the answer before he had finished asking the question, because in his world no one had ever told him no. Adeline closed her scheduling book, stood up, and told him she would come with him. He faltered, because he had prepared 3 arguments to persuade her, and did not need a single one of them. In the car, with the October rain hammering against the glass, he pressed a pen into her hand before she had even settled into her seat, and she braced the form against her knee and wrote, not the name printed on the employee badge she had carried for 3 years, but the name she had buried the day her family's house was taken from them. The name this building had once whispered the way people whisper about a disease. Adeline Ferraro. He was on the phone, watching the rain streak down the window, so he did not see it. But within 40 minutes, he would look down at that signature, and everything he believed about the last 10 years would come apart beneath his feet. If this story is worth staying with to the very end, leave a like so we know we're telling it right. Share it with someone you think would understand Adeline, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories we bring you each week. The car came to a stop in the middle of the Wells Street Bridge, trapped behind a truck hauling construction materials, and Gio switched the windshield wipers off for a beat, then turned them back on because the rain was coming down too hard. Massimo ended the call, and in the silence that followed, he did the thing he had done with every document in his life, the habit his father had taught him when he was 19, which was to turn over the paper he had just signed and check the signature on the other side. He wasn't suspicious of anything. He was only checking. Then he froze. He read the last name very slowly, separating each syllable as though saying it carefully enough might somehow make it rearrange itself into something less frightening. And when it refused to become anything else, he read it a second time. Ferraro. He looked up at her, and Adeline didn't look away. She didn't deny it, didn't apologize, didn't rush to explain herself like someone who had been caught. She simply sat straight in the leather seat, both hands resting in her lap, and waited for him to ask. She said her father's name was Angelo Ferraro. She said the name clearly and in full, swallowing none of the sounds, because for 10 years she hadn't been able to say it anywhere someone might hear. The chief accountant of Rinaldi Holdings. The man everyone in that 41-story building believed had taken $41 million from the family and then died in a car crash on Interstate 78, 3 weeks before his trial. A crash no one had bothered to reopen because no one had seen any reason to. She had been 19 that year. Her mother died a year later, from illness, and from things the doctors never wrote down on any form. At 20, she signed over the house on Grand Street, carried 2 suitcases out the door, changed to her mother's last name at the county courthouse, and started working the night shift the following week. She told him all of it in less than 2 minutes, in the voice of someone who had repeated the story inside her own head thousands of times, until there was nowhere left for trembling to hide. Massimo said nothing. The rain struck the roof of the car in a steady rhythm, and outside, the line of traffic on the bridge crept forward half a wheel turn before stopping again. He looked down at the form in his hand, the one stamped by the law office, his signature sitting directly above hers, the 2 names separated by exactly 1 ruled line. Then he asked, his voice dropping almost to a murmur, and Adeline had worked for him long enough to know that when he lowered his voice, he was at his most dangerous. What she had come into this building to do. She answered that she had come to find what no one had been willing to look for in 10 years. He asked whether she had found it, and she said no, not yet, and that was precisely the problem. For the past 3 years, she hadn't been searching for evidence, because the evidence wasn't in any computer system she was allowed to access, and it wasn't in any file that could be opened with an assistant's employee badge. For 3 years she had been doing something else, something slower and more patient, finding out where they had hidden it. She had found that. She knew exactly where it was, which box, which floor, Behind which door? Then she had sat down at a desk 12 steps from his and waited for a door to open. Massimo asked the next question, and he asked it like a man placing the weight of his entire morning on a scale. Whether she had known about the trust provision beforehand. Had she known there would come a day when he would need a signature so urgently that he wouldn't have time to ask the last name of the person signing? Adeline looked straight at him and said no. She said that until 8 o'clock that morning, when he pushed open the door and walked in, she had known nothing about his grandfather's will, nothing about the 35th birthday, nothing about the 6 years he had believed he still had. She said that if she had been capable of arranging a morning like this one, she wouldn't have had to spend 3 years wiping desks and making coffee and scheduling meetings for people who looked at her as though she were a shadow. And that was the truth. Massimo said nothing more. He remained silent for nearly the entire length of the bridge, long enough that Gio glanced into the rearview mirror twice, and in that silence Adeline understood that this man was calculating, that he was rearranging every piece of the last 10 years, and discovering they no longer fit together the way they once had. When the car reached the bottom of the bridge, he folded the form, slipped it into the breast pocket of his jacket, and said the only thing he would say for the rest of the drive, that no matter what happened, he still had to get to City Hall before 5 o'clock that afternoon. At 4:05 in the afternoon, the marriage license office at the Cook County Courthouse had 14 people waiting in line, and a fluorescent light in the left corner flickering in an uneven rhythm that no one had bothered reporting for repair. Massimo didn't get in line. He walked straight to counter number 3, set the application down, and the clerk behind the glass looked at the name on it, then at him, and didn't ask another question about whose turn it was. Adeline stood 1 step behind him, holding her small handbag in both hands, silently counting the minutes they had left, 55 minutes, and she knew that under normal circumstances, it took about 20 minutes to complete a file in this office, if no one asked any questions. The clerk had just opened the ledger when the glass door behind them swung open, and Adeline recognized the sound of a cane striking the stone floor before she had time to turn around. Rocco Rinaldi walked in with a lawyer carrying a leather briefcase, and he didn't shout, didn't push anyone aside, didn't do anything that would draw attention in an unpleasant way. He smiled at the 2 people sitting on the bench nearby, nodded to the security guard, then walked up to counter number 3 and addressed the clerk by her first name, the name printed on the small plastic badge pinned to her chest, and asked about the knee. He said he remembered her complaining about back in the spring. The clerk smiled, and Adeline understood at once that the fight had already begun and they were losing. Rocco said he was terribly sorry to trouble her, that he wasn't there in any capacity except as an uncle, and that his family was dealing with an unresolved internal dispute concerning managerial competence, a private matter, a sad matter, something he didn't wish to discuss in public. He said his nephew had been through several very difficult months since his father died. He said he had come only to ask that the application be delayed for a few days, just 3 days, long enough for the family to sit down together. And he said all of it with such sincere concern in his voice that the entire room believed him, including the 2 people waiting on the nearby bench, who had never heard the name Rinaldi in their lives. Massimo didn't argue. He stood perfectly still, and Adeline saw his jaw tighten, and she understood that anything he said now would only prove exactly what his uncle had just described. The clerk set down her pen. She said perhaps waiting a few days wouldn't hurt, sir. The lawyer had already opened his leather briefcase and taken out a pre-printed document, and that was when Adeline stepped forward half a pace, set her handbag on the counter, opened it, and took from the innermost compartment a sheet of paper yellowed along the edges, the paper she had carried with her for 10 years to every place she had ever slept overnight. She laid it in front of the clerk and told her to read it carefully. A birth certificate, county seal, father's name Angelo Ferraro, mother's name Marisa Beckett. Adeline said she was a legally competent adult, that the man standing beside her was as well, that there was no legal impediment between them under the laws of Illinois, no existing marriage, no blood relation, no court order prohibiting the union. She said she understood that Mr. Rinaldi had every right to have an opinion about matters within his own family, and she respected that completely. But a relative's opinion wasn't a legal impediment, and it had never been listed in any provision of the statute. Then she added, still in the same calm voice she used when reading back the morning schedule, that a records clerk who refused or delayed issuing a license to 2 eligible applicants on the oral request of a third party, with no legal standing in the application, had provided sufficient grounds for a formal complaint to the Cook County Records Office, and that the complaint would bear the name of the person who signed the final box, not the name of anyone else in this room. The clerk looked down at the plastic badge on her chest. Then she picked up her pen. The lawyer closed his leather briefcase without taking out another sheet of paper. Rocco's expression didn't change at all. He kept the same smile, only now it wasn't directed at anyone in particular. The seal came down at 4:41 in the afternoon, and the sound of it was dry, clean, final, and Massimo let out a breath that Adeline thought he might have been holding since 8 o'clock that morning. Rocco waited until the two of them turned toward the door. Then he stepped closer, leaned near her ear, and said in the warm voice an uncle might use with a niece who had just done something worthy of praise, that her mother made excellent almond cookies. Miss Beckett, I ate them twice at your house on Grand Street. Then he walked away. Adeline stood still in the middle of the hallway, the birth certificate still in her hand, and realized two things at once. He had just called her by the false last name she had adopted at the county courthouse after her father died, and he had just spoken about a house that wasn't named on any piece of paper she had placed on that counter. The penthouse apartment was on Lakeshore Drive, and Massimo opened the door with a code instead of a key, then walked straight into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water without offering her one. He pointed toward the living room and told her she could sleep wherever she wanted, that the second bedroom was at the end of the hall, the towels were in the cabinet, and if she needed anything, she should help herself. He didn't explain further, didn't apologize for how bare the arrangement was, didn't say a single thing that could be mistaken for an invitation. Adeline set her handbag on the chair near the window and thought that in the past 3 years she had stood in this room exactly 4 times, every time to deliver documents, every time for no more than 2 minutes. Then Massimo turned back, leaned against the edge of the dining table, and asked the question he had been carrying in his head since the Wells Street Bridge. What did she have in her hands? Not what did she know. What did she have? Adeline opened her bag. She didn't take out a file, didn't take out a hard drive, didn't take out anything a man in his line of work would have expected. She took out a stack of her own pay statements. 3 years, 36 pay periods, printed and stapled together at the corner, and laid them on the table in front of him. Massimo looked at the stack, then at her, and she told him to look at the deductions column. He flipped through it. On every pay statement, 40% of her income had been automatically deducted and transferred into an account labeled Internal Damage Restitution Fund, with the reference code matching the case file number under the name Angelo Ferraro. Massimo turned over 3 more pages, then stopped. He said, his voice slower than usual, that there was no law in this country that made a child criminally responsible for a father's actions, that even if her father had been convicted, restitution could only have been enforced against his estate, not against her wages, and that her father had never even been found guilty of anything by a court because he had died before the trial date. He said this wasn't merely wrong. It was so blatantly wrong that any first-year associate could have torn it apart in a single afternoon. Adeline said she knew. Massimo looked up. She said she had known from the very first day. She said they had put the agreement in front of her during her probationary week, with an explanation that it was a necessary procedure for human resources to approve the hiring file of someone with that last name at a company like this, that if she didn't sign, the file would be sent back. And they had said it in the voices of people who were certain. A 26-year-old woman, who had spent 4 years waiting tables on the night shift, would sign anything to keep a seat on the 41st floor. She signed it, and she signed it precisely because it was illegal. Massimo didn't understand immediately, and she let him remain confused for a few more seconds before continuing. She said that if her father had truly taken $41 million, there would have been a judgment. There would have been an enforcement order. There would have been a thick federal court file that anyone could look up. But there was nothing. No judgment at all. And yet there was still an account collecting money for a debt that had never been declared. Steadily, twice a month, for 3 years. She said an account like that didn't simply appear by itself inside a system. Someone had to open it. Someone had to authorize it. And whoever signed that approval was leaving their own fingerprints on the very case they had constructed 10 years earlier. She looked at him and said she had paid 40% of her wages for 3 years to buy a signature, and now he should read the final line. Massimo picked up the pay statement. He turned to the bottom of the page, where the approval field for the deduction agreement was printed, the field no one ever read, the field that should have carried the name of some human resources manager. He read it. Then he lowered the page to the table very slowly, and said so quietly that Adeline had to lean closer to hear him, that no human resources department in the world could have approved something like this, and that the name in that box had never worked a single day in human resources. 3 characters. R. Rinaldi. Adeline said the approval date was in the 4th month, after she had started working there. She said she had counted it many times. Massimo straightened away from the edge of the table, and in that moment, Adeline saw on his face the thing she had been living with for the past 3 years, the thing that came slowly and in pieces, rather than in an explosion. His uncle had known who she was by the 4th month. He hadn't fired her. He hadn't told anyone. He had kept her there, exactly 12 steps from his nephew's office, where he could see her every time he came up to the 41st floor. And he had made her sign a document accepting responsibility for her father's money, a document bearing her own signature, so that if the old case was ever dragged back into the light, this building would already have a second person with the name Ferraro, waiting to carry all of it on her shoulders. On the morning of the 4th day, Massimo asked her where the door she had spent 3 years waiting for was, and Adeline answered without having to think, because that answer had been sitting in her mind since the winter of her first year. Archive number 7, South Harbor District, basement level, innermost room on the left, where all of Rinaldi Holdings' paper records from before the company went digital were kept. She said she had checked the archive index 23 times over 3 years, had memorized the number on every box, and knew exactly which ones held the subcontractor agreements from the years when her father was still alive. She had simply never been able to get inside. Her employee badge wouldn't open that door. No assistant-level clearance could open it. No code, no exception, because that room accepted the fingerprints of only 4 people in the entire organization. Massimo picked up the car keys and said, "Let's go." On the way down to the harbor, Adeline realized something she would think about many times afterward, that this marriage, only 3 days old, hadn't given her any authority at all. It hadn't given her a badge, a code, or a title. It had only given her someone willing to open a door. Massimo pressed his finger to the reader. The light turned green, and he held the steel door open for her to go in first. Inside, it was cold and dark, with steel shelves rising all the way to the ceiling in long rows, and Adeline walked straight ahead without looking around, turned left at the 4th aisle, counted down to the 2nd shelf, and pulled out the archive box whose number she had memorized. It took her 40 minutes to find what she was looking for. Massimo stood beside her without rushing her, and from time to time he reached over to hold the lid of the box open. Then she stopped. She pulled out a hardcover file, opened it on top of the box, and inside were 7 subcontractor agreements signed during the last 2 years of her father's life. 7 contracts, 3 legal entities, and when she added together every amount on the final lines, the total came to $41 million. Exactly $41 million, not a cent more. Every one of them was listed under harbor operating expenses. Every one bore Angelo Ferraro's approval signature in the lower right corner. Massimo said the names of the 3 companies aloud: Coastline Aggregate, Bridgeport Marine Services, Halstead Freight Partners, and said he had never heard of a single one of them in his life, even though he had been running this harbor for 4 years. Adeline didn't answer right away. She opened her handbag and took out a card worn soft at all 4 corners, the birthday card her father had written by hand when she turned 18, the thing she had carried with her for 10 years along with her birth certificate. She placed the card beside the contract, signature next to signature, beneath the white fluorescent light of the basement room. Massimo bent closer. No one had to point anything out to him. The signature on the card flowed easily, the tail of the letters stretching out and lifting at the final stroke, the mark of a man who had written his own name tens of thousands of times and no longer had to think while doing it. The signature on the contract was more upright, rounder, the connecting strokes broken in 2 places, with the smallest hesitation before the first letter of the last name, the hesitation of someone looking at a sample and copying it, the hand of someone writing another man's name. Massimo turned to the 2nd contract, then the 3rd, and in every one of them that hesitation appeared in exactly the same place. He asked her how long she had known. Adeline said she hadn't known, that she had seen it for the first time 2 minutes ago, just as he had. What she knew was something else. She said that 3 years earlier, during her first month on the job, she had searched all 3 company names in the Illinois Business Registry, because they were the only 3 names that appeared in the unfinished indictment her father's lawyer had left behind. No company called Coastline Aggregate had ever been registered in the state. There was no Bridgeport Marine Services, no Halstead Freight Partners, no tax identification numbers, no business licenses, no headquarters addresses except for a post office box in Cicero that she had driven to herself to see with her own eyes, and it was nothing more than a mailbox in a row of boxes inside a laundromat. She said she had known for 3 years that those 3 companies didn't exist, but knowing that without the contracts in her hands only made her an assistant sitting at a desk, searching directories. Massimo said nothing. He picked up the first contract, set it back down, then lowered himself fully onto the edge of the archive box, both elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the concrete floor for a very long time. Adeline remained still and let him sit there. Then he said, very quietly in that basement room where the only sound came from the ventilation system, that his uncle hadn't stolen $41 million. His uncle had invented it. He had created 3 names on paper, written 7 contracts, sent the money through those 3 names, and then somewhere no one knew. And afterward he had needed a name to put all of it on. He needed someone who understood the books well enough for the accusation to sound believable, and who had little enough power that no one would defend him. He chose the chief accountant. On the 6th day, Massimo didn't call the family's lawyers. Adeline realized that when he read an address aloud to Gio, an old office building on LaSalle Street, and she remembered that in all 3 years she had managed his calendar, no name outside the 2 familiar firms had ever appeared in it. He said the man they were going to meet was Arthur Kessler, a forensic accountant in his 60s, a man who had never worked a single day for the Rinaldi family, and that was exactly why he had chosen him. He said it in an ordinary voice, as though it were nothing more than a technical decision. But Adeline understood what it meant. For the first time in Massimo Rinaldi's life, he was taking a family file outside the family, and he was doing it because he no longer knew who inside his own house could be trusted. Kessler's office was narrow, its walls crowded with file folders, and he didn't offer tea, didn't make conversation, only pulled on a pair of thin cloth gloves and told them to put the contracts on the table and sit still. He worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He used an angled lamp, a magnifying glass, a flatbed scanner, and he asked Massimo to provide 4 genuine samples of Angelo Ferraro's signature from unrelated sources. Massimo produced 3 from old personnel records, and Adeline provided the 4th, her birthday card. Kessler picked up the card, looked at her for a second, then placed it carefully on the scanner, as though setting down something fragile. When he finally looked up, he said he was going to answer 3 questions, and he answered them in order. First, all 7 signatures on the 7 contracts were forged, and deliberately so. He said he had measured pen pressure, stroke speed, and the pause at the starting point, and all 7 carried the same characteristics, the same hesitation before the first letter of the last name, longer than normal, the same shortened upward sweep at the end of the final stroke. He said this wasn't a man signing while tired, and it wasn't a man signing in a hurry. This was another hand trying to follow an existing model, and it was the same hand all 7 times. Second, the 3 legal entities named in the contracts didn't exist. He had checked that morning, and none of the names appeared in the state business registry. None had a federal tax identification number. None had filed a tax return in any year. But the money was real, he said. The money had passed through 3 bank accounts opened at a suburban branch, and all 3 accounts had periodically transferred their balances to the same place, a trust registered in Delaware, and that trust had exactly 1 beneficiary. Massimo asked for the name. Kessler said he wasn't permitted to disclose it without a court order, but he could say that the beneficiary's last name was Rinaldi, and that it wasn't Massimo's father. Then Kessler said there was a 3rd answer, and he pulled the final 2 contracts from the stack, placed them side by side, and turned them toward Adeline. He pointed to the date field at the top of each page. He said the 6th contract had been signed in March. He said the 7th had been signed in September of the following year. Then he looked up at her and said, "Mrs. Rinaldi, according to the records I have, your father died in November of the year before that." The room went silent. Adeline could hear the office clock on the wall, something she hadn't noticed existed at any point that morning. Kessler continued in the even voice of a man, simply reading out a result, saying that this meant the sequence of forgeries hadn't stopped when Angelo Ferraro died. It continued for another 2 years. Someone had still sat down, still taken out that signature sample, and still continued signing the name of a man already in the ground to draw out more money, because that person knew no one would check anymore, because the case had been closed along with the coffin. He said that in a courtroom, this wasn't circumstantial evidence. It was exculpatory evidence. A dead man couldn't sign contracts. And Adeline sat down. She lowered herself onto the wooden chair behind her. For the first time since 8 o'clock on the morning, she had signed her real name on the application in the car, and placed both hands on her knees to keep them from trembling. 10 years. 10 years of wiping desks, carrying coffee, studying accounting at night, changing her name, hiding herself, sitting 12 steps from a man and waiting for a door. 10 years spent searching for something enormous. A ledger, a recording, a confession. And the thing that cleared her father's name turned out to be the simplest thing in the world, something that had been sitting in the upper right corner of a sheet of paper for 8 years, while no one had bothered to bend down and read it. A date. Massimo said nothing. He only reached across the table and pushed the birthday card back toward her, very gently, as though returning something that should never have been allowed to leave her hands in the first place. Massimo didn't say a single word all evening on the 7th day. He came back to the apartment a little before 7 o'clock, took off his coat, and sat down in the chair by the window overlooking the lake. And he stayed there as darkness settled completely, as the lights along Lakeshore Drive came on in 2 golden lines, running side by side. Adeline cooked something in the kitchen and left it untouched because she knew no one was going to eat. She had worked for him for 3 years, and she had learned that when he spoke less, he was weighing things. But when he said nothing at all, it meant he had already made his decision. At 9:15, he took out his phone and made one call. It lasted less than 6 seconds, and he said only 2 words. "Come up." Gio arrived within 15 minutes. He didn't ring the bell. The door opened, and he was already standing there, the shoulders of his coat still wet from the rain, and he didn't step inside. He stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides, didn't sit, didn't take off his coat, didn't ask a single question. He only looked at Massimo and waited. Adeline understood immediately what was happening, and she understood it not from anything anyone said, but from the way Gio stood there, the posture of a man who had stood in doorways like this many times in his life and knew exactly what he was waiting for. In this house, orders weren't explained. Anyone who asked twice had already made a mistake. Gio was waiting only for a nod. Adeline set the towel down on the kitchen counter and stepped out. She didn't speak to Gio. She spoke to Massimo. And she didn't talk about right or wrong, didn't talk about guilt, didn't say anything that might sound like a sermon, because she knew that with a man like him, a sermon wouldn't stop anyone for more than 3 seconds. She said that if Rocco disappeared tonight, then her father would remain a thief forever. She said that case had already been closed once, closed along with a coffin, and the only reason it had been so easy to close was because the man accused was no longer there to argue. Dead men couldn't argue. She said he knew that better than she did, because just yesterday morning he had sat in an office on LaSalle Street and listened to a stranger prove what people could do with the signature of a man who had been in the ground for 8 years. She said that if Rocco Rinaldi disappeared tonight, then 3 days from now there would be an explanation, and that explanation would be written by the people who were still alive, and she had lived long enough to know what the living wrote when they needed a name to carry the blame. Then she said the last thing, and she said it more slowly than everything that had come before. She said she didn't need him to pay. She had never spent 10 years trying to make anyone pay. She needed him standing in a room where people could hear, where the people listening carried weight, and she needed him to be forced into silence while she spoke. She needed that silence to have witnesses. Then she asked him, "Will you give me that?" Massimo didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a very long time, long enough that Gio shifted his weight slightly in the doorway, and through all of it Adeline didn't look away and didn't add another word, because she had learned from Massimo himself that the person who kept talking after saying enough was the person negotiating from weakness. Outside, a freighter sounded its horn across the lake, a deep, drawn-out note that faded slowly into nothing. Massimo rose from the chair. He walked to the door, stopped in front of Gio, and said one word, "Go." Gio nodded. He didn't ask why, didn't look relieved, didn't show anything at all, and he turned and walked back into the hallway, exactly as he had come in. Then he stopped at the threshold, one hand resting against the doorframe, and looked back at Massimo. He said that Massimo's father had once told him to go in exactly the same way. Once, 10 years ago. Then he left, and the elevator doors closed at the far end of the hallway, and Massimo remained standing where he was, one hand still on the doorknob, staring into the empty corridor long after the sound of the elevator had disappeared. On the 9th day, Kessler called them back to his office on LaSalle Street, and the first thing he said after they sat down was that he wanted to see the file Massimo had been holding on the morning of the first day. Massimo asked why. Because that file had nothing to do with the forgery. It was only the trust bank's notice about the marriage provision, something he had skimmed twice that night and never read again, because by then he had only 9 hours left to find a wife. Kessler said he had been doing this work for 32 years, and in those 32 years he had learned that when someone was pushed into a window of time so narrow they could barely breathe, the first thing to do wasn't to run inside that window, but to ask who had built it. Massimo took the file from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. Kessler put on his gloves, opened it, and read for 18 minutes without saying a word. Then he removed 2 sheets, laid them side by side, and turned them around. He said the page on the left was the original trust instrument for the Emilio Rinaldi Trust, established in 1974, and he pointed to the 11th line of the 4th provision. There, in faded type, it clearly stated that the beneficiary had to marry before his 40th birthday. 40. Massimo looked down at the line and said nothing. Kessler pointed to the page on the right. It was a 3-page amendment, typed on modern paper, signed in 2011, changing only one detail in the entire instrument, lowering the age limit from 40 to 35. Beneath it was the signature of Emilio Rinaldi, his grandfather, who had died in 2014. Kessler said he had compared that signature that morning with 3 genuine samples taken from the same file. He said he hadn't needed a magnifying glass this time, because he had already seen that hesitation 6 days earlier, that pause before the first letter of the last name that lasted longer than it should, that shortened tail at the final stroke, the same hand that had written Angelo Ferraro's signature 7 times. Massimo placed both hands flat on the desk. Kessler wasn't finished. He said there was one more detail, and this one required no forensic examination at all. He took out the trust bank's confirmation sheet included in the file and pointed to the line showing the date the supplemental document had been entered into the custodial system. The amendment had been registered with the bank only 3 weeks earlier. Kessler said the systems used by major trust banks ran automatically, that when a trust instrument was updated, the software reviewed every deadline in it and automatically generated a notice to the beneficiary if it detected one approaching, and it sent that notice at whatever hour of the day the process happened to finish. He said that was why a letter this important had arrived at 11 o'clock at night, instead of during business hours like every other piece of correspondence in the past 30 years. No one had sent it. The system had generated it on its own. Adeline sat perfectly still and watched Massimo understand it piece by piece, slowly, without any explosion, exactly the way she had seen it happen on his face in the basement at the Harbor Archive. He had 6 years left. He had always had 6 years left. The day around which his entire life had revolved for 9 hours. The day he had burst through the office door of a woman he had never truly looked at and begged her to sign a piece of paper. That day had never existed. It had been manufactured. It had been signed, typed, and entered into the bank system 3 weeks earlier by someone who knew exactly what would happen when the software finished running. Kessler stated the rest dryly, as though he were reading from an index. If the beneficiary failed to marry before the deadline, the 51% beneficial interest would be suspended and temporarily transferred to the administrator of the family trust until the board made a new determination. Massimo asked who the administrator of the family trust was, even though all 3 people in the room already knew the answer, and he asked only because he needed to hear it spoken aloud by someone outside the family. Kessler said the name. On the drive back, the car moved along LaSalle Street between 2 rows of lights, and Massimo stared out the window for a long time before speaking. He said he had married her because of a forged document. Adeline looked over at him and said, "Then it's the only thing in this house that told the truth." Massimo turned to look at her, and they both thought of the same thing, without either one saying it aloud. That the man who had constructed all of this had calculated every step correctly, had calculated every hour of those 9 hours, had calculated that his nephew would panic, would race across the city, would be turned away, and wouldn't make it in time. He had calculated everything correctly except for one thing. He hadn't accounted for the fact that inside that 41-story building there was a woman who had been waiting for 10 years, and that when she was asked, she would be able to say yes within 7 seconds. On the morning of the 10th day, Kessler called them at 7 o'clock and said he had been awake since 4, and that he needed them to come immediately, rather than wait until the afternoon. When the 2 of them walked in, there was already a new file on his desk that hadn't been there the night before, stamped by the trust bank, and he pushed it toward Adeline instead of Massimo. He said he had asked the bank to review every account still being held under the name Angelo Ferraro, and he had found something that, he admitted plainly, he hadn't expected. Her father hadn't been paid only in cash. During his final 4 years as chief accountant, part of his compensation had been issued in preferred voting shares of Rinaldi Holdings, amounting to 12% in total. Adeline said she hadn't known anything about that, and she said it in the voice of someone who had just been told that her own house contained another room she had never entered. Kessler said there was no way she could have known. He explained that when the case broke, those shares had been frozen as a matter of procedure pending the outcome of the trial, but the trial never took place, because the defendant died 3 weeks before the court date. Without a judgment, there could be no forfeiture order. So for 10 years, that 12% had remained in an escrow account at the trust bank, belonging to no one, taken by no one, simply frozen. Massimo asked why no one had told her about it in all those 10 years. Kessler said because no one was allowed to. The trust bank disclosed escrow records only to someone with legal standing, directly connected to the corporate entity behind them. A young woman who had changed her last name, worked night shifts as a waitress, then became an administrative assistant, could have called 100 times and never made it past the first question from the switchboard. He said that door opened only for the wife of the trust beneficiary. Adeline sat in silence for a long time, thinking about the 3 years she had spent sitting 12 steps away from him, thinking about all the evenings she had stayed past 9 o'clock searching archive indexes, and she realized that the thing she had needed most had never been inside any box in the basement of the Harbor Archive. It had been waiting behind a question about legal standing that she had only gained the answer to 10 days ago. Then Kessler took out a sheet of paper and wrote 4 numbers on it, because he said he needed both of them to see at the same time what he was seeing. The Emilito Rinaldi Trust held 51%, with Massimo as beneficiary, contingent upon marriage. The family trust held 22%, administered by Rocco. Angelo Ferraro's shares amounted to 12%, still frozen. The remaining 15% was divided among allied families. Kessler said that if the 12% passed to Adeline, then there would be 2 people bearing the name Rinaldi, sitting on the same side of the table with 63%. If it didn't go to her, Massimo asked, where would it go? Kessler said that under the trust instrument, once the 10-year freeze period expired without a confirmed heir, the entire block of shares would transfer into the family trust. He said the number slowly. 22 plus 12 was 34. Then he looked up at the clock on the wall and said there were exactly 18 days left in that 10-year period. Adeline asked what she had to do, and that was when Kessler took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and said he was going to explain the hardest part. Her signature would only begin the process. The trust instrument required the heir to be confirmed by the family council in a formal meeting, and there was only one person with the authority to convene that meeting, the administrator of the family trust. Massimo said nothing. Adeline looked at the number 34 on the page and immediately understood that the man wouldn't call the meeting today, or this week. He would let the clock run. He would sit still and watch 18 days shrink to 10, then 5, then 1, and he would call the meeting on the final day, because he believed that by then he would have forced the 2 of them into a corner and could demand whatever terms he wanted. Kessler pushed the escrow release form toward her and said there was one more thing she needed to know before she signed. The bank's terms required the heir to appear publicly under her legal name, her real name, on the corporate records, on the shareholder register, and on every document issued from the date of signing forward. He said that meant from the moment she signed, there would be no Miss Beckett anymore, anywhere, ever again. Adeline looked down at the form. She thought of the name her mother had left her, the name that had sheltered her for 10 years in every place she had ever slept, in every place she had ever applied for work, the thin shell she had used to survive. Then she picked up the pen and signed without hesitation, and she signed with the exact same name she had written on the marriage application inside the car in the October rain. Gio's words had been sitting in Massimo's mind for 5 days, and they hadn't stayed still. His father had once told him to go in exactly the same way. Once, 10 years ago. 10 years ago was the year Angelo Ferraro died. On the afternoon of the 12th day, Massimo drove alone to the old house in Oak Park, the house he hadn't entered since the funeral, and Adeline went with him because he never told her not to. He opened the door to his father's study, switched on the light, and in 4 years nothing in the room had changed. Not even the chair still turned slightly toward the window. The safe was built into the wall cabinet behind the bookcase. Massimo entered the code, his parents' wedding date, and the steel door opened with a dry metallic sound. There was no money inside. There were 4 leather-bound notebooks, an unloaded gun resting in a wooden case, a stack of property documents, and his grandfather's watch. And at the very bottom, lying flat beneath everything else, was a large ivory yellow envelope. Massimo took it out. On the front, handwritten, was the sender's name, Angelo Ferraro. Beneath it was a date, and Adeline didn't need to calculate to know it was 3 weeks before her father died. The edge of the envelope had been slit open. It had been opened a long time ago. Massimo sat down on the floor with his back against the cabinet and pulled out the papers inside. Adeline sat beside him, watching each page pass beneath his hands, and she recognized everything. A comparison of the 3 legal entities against the Illinois Business Registry, with the words not found underlined in blue ballpoint ink. Copies of 4 of the 7 contracts, with notes in the margins about the hesitation before the first letter of the last name. A hand-drawn money flow diagram tracing the 3 accounts at the suburban branch to a trust registered in Delaware. Everything she had spent 10 years rebuilding had already been assembled 10 years before her, across 9 sheets of paper, in blue ballpoint ink, by the very man whose name she had spent all those years trying to restore. On the final page, beneath a column of figures, there was a handwritten line in the same flowing script, with the upward lift at the final stroke. The stroke Adeline had seen 1,000 times on her birthday card. Salvatore, I don't know who else to give this to. Nothing more. No plea. No accusation. No one's name mentioned. Only one sentence from a man who had understood that he was standing alone and had chosen to send it anyway. Massimo said nothing. He turned back to the first page, then to the last, then back to the first, and he did that 3 times. Adeline didn't stop him. She knew he was looking for something else. A 10th sheet. A note from his father in the margin. Something that would prove the man had done something after reading it. There was nothing. The envelope had been opened, read, placed at the bottom of the safe beneath the stack of property documents, and left there for 10 years. Massimo sat on the floor for a very long time, still holding the envelope, while outside the room slowly darkened until the only light left was the desk lamp he had switched on when they came in. Then he spoke, and his voice was rough in the way of someone who hadn't spoken for a long time. He said his father had taught him 3 things from the time he was 15, and he had lived by those 3 things his entire life. Don't touch women. Don't touch outsiders. Never sell out one of your own. He said he had believed those were the things that made his family different from every other family in this city, that they were what allowed him to hold his head up when he passed the church on Taylor Street. Then he raised the envelope slightly and said his father had known. He had known what his younger brother had done to the name of a man who worked for him. He had read every line of those 9 pages, and he had put them at the bottom of a safe, sat in that chair for another 4 years, and never mentioned them to anyone. Adeline didn't comfort him. She didn't put a hand on his shoulder, didn't say perhaps his father had his reasons, didn't say any of the things an ordinary person might say in a room like this. She sat quietly beside him until he fell completely silent. Then she said his father had chosen to preserve the house. She said he had looked at 2 things on a scale. On one side, the name of an accountant. On the other, an entire family line and everything it would lose if the truth came out. And he had chosen the heavier side, and she wasn't going to stand there and tell him that choice had been easy. Then she said the rest more slowly. She said that 5 days ago, a man had stood in the doorway of their apartment waiting for a nod, and Massimo had told him to go. She said that 10 days ago, he had taken his own family's records outside the family and handed them to a stranger on LaSalle Street, knowing exactly what that meant. She said his father had chosen to preserve the house, and Massimo was choosing differently. That was the entire difference between the 2 of them, and she told him that difference was far greater than he understood right now. Rocco Rinaldi didn't send a single letter, didn't file a single petition, didn't put his name on a single piece of paper, and that was precisely why there was no way to fight what he did on the 15th day. He simply went to dinner. He had dinner in 3 places over 3 consecutive evenings, with 3 older men whose words still carried weight in this city. And at all 3 tables he told the same story, in the same sorrowful voice, of a man acting against his wishes. He told them that his nephew had married a woman on the morning of the day he had only 9 hours to marry. He told them that the woman's real name was Adeline Ferraro, daughter of the chief accountant, who had taken $41 million from the common fund, money in which all 3 families sitting here had held a share. Then he added the one detail that changed the shape of the story entirely. He said he had thought long and hard, and had convinced himself that the boy had simply panicked, simply grabbed the nearest woman in the room, but he hadn't panicked. He had taken her down to the Harbor Archive using his own fingerprint. He had carried internal family records to an outsider on LaSalle Street. He had known who she was from the very first day. He never used the word accomplice. He merely laid out those 3 facts in order, and let the men at the table fit them together themselves. And they did it quickly, because that was what people always did with a story arranged carefully enough. The consequences came within 48 hours, and each one could be counted. On the morning of the 16th day, 3 partners withdrew from the contract for operations at berth number 3, all 3 citing internal restructuring, all 3 sending their letters within 2 hours of one another. That afternoon, the meeting with the Port Authority Board was cancelled 40 minutes before it was due to begin. The secretary called to say they would reschedule, and no one ever called back. That evening, Gio drove to the restaurant on Taylor Street to pick up food. The restaurant that had kept a corner table for the Rinaldi family for 30 years, and the man at the door told him they were full that night. Gio came back empty-handed and reported it in exactly 5 words. They're full tonight. Massimo didn't ask another question because they both understood that a small restaurant on Taylor Street didn't decide on its own to turn away the Rinaldi family. Adeline watched all of it from the dining table in the penthouse apartment, where she had spread out the files and worked for 3 days, and she recorded each thing in her notebook exactly the way she had once recorded his meetings for 3 years. On the night of the 16th day, when Massimo came home, she closed the notebook and told him she thought she should leave. She said it calmly, arranged neatly like a proposal, with sound reasoning on all 3 sides. She said she could move out that night, could stay in a hotel under another name, could continue working with Kessler by phone. She said the 12% didn't need her sitting in this apartment to exist. It only needed her signature, and the signature had already been given. She said there were 11 days left, and during those 11 days the most important thing was that he not lose another partner. She laid out all of it clearly, without a wasted sentence. And in the final sentence, when she said that no one in this city had ever truly considered her his wife anyway, her voice trembled, only once, only on the last 3 words. Then she stopped and said nothing more. Massimo took off his coat, hung it over the back of a chair, and didn't answer immediately. He poured himself a glass of water, drank half of it, then set it down. Then he said he would answer her, but he wouldn't answer with the thing she was waiting to hear and also afraid to hear. He said he wasn't keeping her there because of feelings, and he said it so plainly that Adeline had to lower her eyes to the table. He said the reason was this. For the past 3 days, his uncle had been telling a story to 3 men, and that story had exactly one weakness, which was that not a single part of it had been proven by anything. No documents, no witnesses, not one line that could be placed in front of the council. It was only a story. Then he said that if he pushed her out the door tonight, if tomorrow morning the entire city saw Massimo Rinaldi hurriedly separating himself from the wife who carried the Ferraro name, then everything his uncle had just said would instantly become truth, without his having to prove a single word. He would win because Massimo ran. He would win for free. Then Massimo said the final part, and he said it much more slowly. He said that 3 days earlier he had sat on the floor of his father's house with 9 sheets of paper in his hands, and he had understood that the man hadn't done anything monstrous at all. He had simply chosen the heavier side of the scale and left one name behind. He said that if tonight he pushed her away to keep 3 contracts and a table at a restaurant on Taylor Street, then he would be doing exactly the same thing, except that he would know perfectly well what he was doing. He said, "I won't become my father." The family council dinner took place on the last Friday evening of every month in the upstairs room of the restaurant on Taylor Street. The same restaurant that had told Gio they were full that night, and Massimo didn't call ahead to reserve a table. He arrived at 10 minutes to 7, and he brought Adeline up by the main staircase instead of through the side entrance. And when the 2 of them stepped into the long room with the walnut table at its center, all 14 people seated there stopped talking at once. Massimo didn't wait for anyone to invite him to sit. He stood at the head of the table with one hand resting on the back of a chair and said that for the past 3 days, a story had been making its way around the city, and since it had been told at other dinner tables, he thought it ought to be told at this one. Then he turned slightly and said, "This is my wife, Adeline Ferraro Rinaldi, daughter of Angelo Ferraro." He said all 3 names clearly, swallowing none of the sounds, never lowering his voice on the middle name, exactly the way she had spoken her father's name in the car on the Wells Street Bridge 16 days earlier. He said that if anyone had questions, they could ask him, tonight, here, instead of asking someone else next week. No one asked. Chairs were pulled out for the 2 of them, and dinner continued the way dinners like that always continued, which meant everyone talked about something else, and no one looked directly at anyone for more than 2 seconds. Adeline remained quiet through most of it, and she realized that at least 4 people in the room had walked past her desk on the 41st floor without ever once looking at her face. Near the end of dinner, she stood and stepped into the hallway, and Bianca Castellano followed her out. Adeline knew her, not in the way people knew a name, but in the way an assistant knew everyone who had ever sat waiting in the lobby on the 41st floor. Bianca stopped a few steps away, folded her arms, and said that she still remembered, that she remembered very clearly the person who had brought her coffee in the lobby. No sugar, extra milk, and that life truly had a strange way of changing, because one moment she had been serving coffee, and now she was sitting at the head of the table. She said it lightly, almost as a joke, in the tone people used when they wanted to leave a bruise while still being able to deny they had meant to. Adeline didn't answer in any of the ways she could have. She already had 3 sentences waiting in her mind, and any one of them would have been enough to make the woman standing in front of her afraid to walk back into that room. She used none of them. She only said, "Yes, I remember. No sugar, extra milk." Then she continued, in exactly the same tone someone might use to talk about the weather, that over 3 years she had scheduled Miss Castellano 11 times, and not one of those 11 appointments had ever been entered into the company's official calendar. She said she had taken every call arranging those meetings, had written each one into her private notebook, and every time she tried to transfer one into the system, someone told her not to. She said that for 3 years she had assumed she was doing something wrong in the process. Then she said she was very glad they had seen each other again tonight, and she walked back into the dining room. Bianca Castellano remained alone in the hallway, her arms still folded across her chest, and she didn't follow. She looked down at the carpet beneath her feet and began to count. 11 times. She remembered all 11 because every time she had prepared for it 2 days in advance. Every time, the person arranging the meeting had been the same man, and he had always said the same thing, that she should be patient, that the boy needed time, that the matter between the two families had been in his plans for years, and he would take care of everything. 11 times in 3 years, she had walked into that building to wait for something a 61-year-old man had promised her father over dinner, and not once out of those 11 times had it been recorded anywhere. She stood in the hallway and understood it not in an explosion, but in a slow chill moving down her spine, the way people understood things they should have understood long ago. A man who truly intended to marry her into his family would have left a trail. He would have wanted a trail. He would have wanted the entire building to see her name on the calendar, wanted the secretaries to know, wanted people to grow accustomed to seeing her there. The only person who needed every trace of 11 meetings erased was someone who had never intended to keep his word. He didn't need her as his nephew's wife. He only needed her father to sit quietly and vote for him when the time came. The second blow came on the afternoon of the 17th day, and this time Rocco Rinaldi didn't go to dinner with anyone. He had an envelope delivered directly to the office on the 41st floor, addressed to Massimo, with no letter enclosed. Inside were 17 pages, copies of the visitor logs from a federal building on South Dearborn Avenue, listing the registered visitor as Adeline Beckett 11 times over 14 months, records of calls between a prepaid phone number and an internal line belonging to an investigative office. And on the final page, one name appeared 5 times, underlined in yellow highlighter: Special Agent Naomi Vance. Massimo brought the envelope back to the apartment and set it on the dining table, directly in front of where Adeline was sitting and working, and he said nothing. She looked down, saw the underlined name, and didn't need to turn another page. He asked her only one question. "Is it true?" She said yes. She didn't deny it, didn't ask where he had gotten the file, didn't say that the records had been selectively cut, even though she knew they had. She pushed the laptop aside, sat up straight, and told him everything from the beginning. She said she had gone to Naomi Vance in the spring of her 2nd year on the job, after she had finished checking the 3 company names and knew for certain that none of them existed, and after she had understood that an assistant holding 3 empty names in her hands couldn't do anything with them. She said she had gone there because she had no other door left. She said that over 14 months, she gave Vance 3 things, and only 3 things: the results of the business registry searches, the address of the mailbox in Cicero, and the identification numbers of the archive boxes in archive number 7 at the harbor, numbers she had traced through the index but had never been able to reach herself. She said she had never given them a single line about Massimo, not one of his meetings, not one name from his calendar, not one trip, not one company figure beyond the 3 fictitious entities. She said she had refused 4 times when they asked. Then she told him about the 5th time. She said that 8 months earlier, Vance had placed a formal cooperation agreement on the table, and the condition was that Adeline begin recording inside the office on the 41st floor and turn over everything, without filtering, including anything unrelated to the forgery case. She said she had stood up from that chair, walked out of the building, thrown the prepaid phone into a storm drain on Dearborn Street, and never gone back. That had been 8 months ago, and in those 8 months she hadn't made contact a single time. Massimo listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt her once. Then he asked why she hadn't told him sooner, and he asked so quietly that Adeline immediately understood this was the most dangerous moment, because 3 years of sitting 12 steps away from him had taught her that the angrier this man became, the lower his voice dropped, and now his voice was barely more than breath. She had 17 days, he said. 17 days. And in those 17 days he had opened a door for her that only 4 people in the entire organization could open, had taken his own family's records to a stranger, had told Gio to go, had stood at the head of the table on Taylor Street and spoken her father's name in front of 14 people. He asked whether, during those 17 days, there had been a single evening when she had meant to tell him. Adeline didn't lie. She said yes, 3 times, and all 3 times she hadn't. He asked why, and she answered that because that morning he had bought her signature, not the truth. She said he had walked into her office at 8 o'clock, offered $2 million and an apartment, and said all of it in the voice of a man who had already known the answer before he finished asking. She said he hadn't asked her a single question about herself, not one. She said she had sat in that car and thought that if she told him everything, he would hear only one thing in everything she said. 2 words, federal investigation, and everything would stop there. She said she hadn't been sure which one he wanted, the signature or the truth, and she had chosen to keep the thing she thought he needed more. Massimo stood completely still for a very long time. Then he reached for the coat draped over the back of the chair, and he said nothing else, didn't say where he was going, didn't say when he would be back, and the door closed behind him, with a very soft sound. Adeline remained alone at the dining table among the pages of the file, and outside, the lights along Lakeshore Drive still ran in 2 parallel golden lines as they did every night. She had lived for 10 years with exactly one thing in her hands, one destination, and she had moved toward it through 4 years of night shifts, through 3 years of making coffee, through every evening she had stayed after 9 o'clock. She had always known what she had, and for the first time in those 10 years, sitting in the penthouse apartment with 11 days left on the clock, she didn't know what she had anymore. Massimo didn't come home all night, and on the morning of the 18th day, Adeline took the westbound bus and walked the rest of the way into Mount Carmel Cemetery, exactly as she had done twice a year for the past 10 years. Her father's grave was in the eastern section, 9th row, a small granite marker bearing only his name and 2 numbers. She came without flowers, because she had never brought flowers, because she had always believed that bringing flowers before the work was finished felt too much like apologizing. She had been standing there for about 5 minutes when she heard the tip of a cane striking the stone path behind her. Rocco Rinaldi came alone, carrying an umbrella, and he stopped 3 steps away, looking down at the marker for a long time before he spoke. He said he had attended the funeral. He said the weather that day had been much like today, and he had stood in the last row, and he remembered a 19-year-old girl standing alone at the head of the grave, with no one beside her. Adeline didn't answer. Then he said he hadn't come to threaten her, that he was 61 years old, and threats were for people who still had something to prove. He said he had come to make an offer, and he asked her to hear all of it before answering. He said he could clear her father's name that very afternoon. No trial, no need to wait out the 8 days remaining on the clock, no council meeting required. He said he would issue an internal correction to all 3 families, confirming that after a review of the old records, the person who had actually withdrawn the $41 million was a contractor behind the 3 entities, while Angelo Ferraro had merely been negligent in approving them during the control process. He said he already had a name, a man who had once worked as a freight contractor in Cicero, dead for 4 years now, no longer there to argue. He said all she had to do was remain quiet for the remaining 8 days, and put nothing before the council, and the name on this stone would be clean before dark. Adeline asked whether the man had anyone left. Rocco paused for a beat, then said there was a wife and 2 children, both grown, and he added that they lived ordinary lives, that this wouldn't drag them into court, that it would only be 1 line in a correction fewer than 20 people in this city would ever read. He said it almost gently, and Adeline stood there in front of the small granite marker and hesitated. She hesitated for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she thought of many things at once. She thought of 4 years waiting tables on the night shift, and the smell of frying oil that clung to her hair no matter how many times she washed it. She thought of 40% of her wages being taken twice a month for 3 years. She thought of the husband she had had for 18 days, who had picked up his coat and walked out the door the night before, without saying when he would be back. She thought that she had nothing left, and that the thing she had spent 10 years walking toward was being placed into her hands right now, free, if only she stayed silent. Then the 3 seconds passed. She looked up and said he was asking her to do exactly what he had done to her father. She said the man in Cicero had a name too, had living people who still carried that name, and 10 years ago her father had also been nothing more than a line in a file fewer than 20 people in this city would ever read. She said she knew exactly what a single line like that could do to a family, because she had lived inside that family. Then she said the final part, and she said it very calmly, without raising her voice by a single word. She said, "I didn't spend 10 years becoming you." Rocco Rinaldi's expression didn't change. He only adjusted the umbrella in his hand and said he was very sorry, that he had thought she was a more practical woman, and that this was the last offer he would ever make her. Then he added one more thing, that her husband hadn't come home last night, and he said it in the voice of a man reporting the weather, and Adeline understood that this was the real reason he had chosen this morning, and no other. He turned and walked along the stone path toward the gate. Adeline remained where she was, and listened as the sound of his cane grew fainter, then disappeared completely. Then there were other footsteps, coming from behind the row of pine trees at the edge of the burial grounds. Massimo stepped out. His coat was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved, and Adeline could see his car parked beyond the fence behind him, in a place no one coming through the main entrance could have seen. He hadn't come there to follow her. He had come because he had spent the entire night driving around the city, and near dawn he had realized that the only place he wanted to go was this one, though he didn't understand why. He had been standing behind the trees before the sound of the cane ever reached the stone path. He heard everything, every word, from the first sentence to the last, on the very morning when he had doubted her more than at any other point in those 18 days. The rain began as they walked from the gravesite toward the gate, and neither of them quickened their pace. So by the time they reached the car, they were both wet, and they sat in silence for the entire drive back, without turning on the heat. When they returned to the penthouse apartment, Massimo hung his wet coat over the back of a chair, stood in the middle of the room, and asked the question he had been carrying in his head for 18 days. He said that morning he had given her 7 seconds. He said he remembered clearly because he had looked at the clock, and he had prepared 3 arguments to persuade her, and hadn't needed a single one. He asked why she had agreed so quickly. Adeline stood leaning against the edge of the dining table, her hair still clinging to her temples, and said she would answer. But the answer was longer than he thought. She said that for 3 years she had sat 12 steps from his desk, and she had counted them, not because she wanted to, but because people couldn't help counting the things they walked past 40 times a day. She said that in those 3 years she knew many things about him that he didn't know anyone knew. She said there was always a box of ginger tea in the second drawer of her desk, and she had replaced it 11 times, because every time his meetings ran past 9 o'clock at night, his stomach bothered him, and he had never once bought anything for it himself, and he had never once asked why a cup of tea appeared on his desk. She said that every time she made a dinner reservation for him, she called ahead and changed the seating because he never sat with his back to the door, and no one had ever told her that. She had simply seen him switch chairs twice during her first year, and written it down in her notebook. Then she told him about a morning in November, when she had knocked on his office door and asked for half the day off without giving a reason, and he had approved it in 2 seconds without asking a single question. She said that was the anniversary of her father's death. She said he hadn't known, and she hadn't wanted him to know. But in those 10 years, it was the only time anyone had ever let her take time off without making her explain why. Massimo said nothing. Adeline looked down at the table and continued with the harder part, the part she had never told anyone, and had believed she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She said she had entered that building with exactly one thing to do, and she had done it properly for 3 years, searching archive indexes, taking notes, waiting. But sometime near the end of the first year, something had started to go wrong. She said there were evenings when she stayed after 9 o'clock and found herself wondering whether she was still there because of the archive index or because there was a light on in the office next door. She said she had hated herself for it, almost every night, for 2 years, because there was always one sentence in her head, that he carried the name that had destroyed her family, and that if her father were still alive and knew, he wouldn't understand his own daughter. Then she said the final thing, and she said it very softly. She said she had come there to get her father's name back, but there were mornings when she was afraid to ask herself whether she was still staying for that, or for him. Massimo stepped toward her. He didn't say anything. He reached for the breast pocket of the shirt she was wearing, the pocket where she had kept a pen clipped for 3 years, and he pulled the pen free. He turned it once in his hand, looked at the worn silver ring around the middle of the barrel, then said that it was his. He said he had dropped it in the hallway on the 41st floor about 2.5 years ago. Adeline said, 3 years and 2 months. Massimo looked up at her. Then he said he knew. He said he had known since last year. He said he had seen the pen clipped to her pocket one afternoon in April, and recognized it immediately, because it was the pen his father had given him when he was 22, and he had searched for it for 3 weeks. He said he had meant to ask, and he hadn't. Adeline asked why. Massimo was silent for a moment, then said that there were 400 people in that building, and every one of those 400 people wanted something from him, a position, a contract, An introduction, a nod. He said he had lived with that since he was 18, and had grown so accustomed to it that he no longer thought about it. Then he said she was the only person in that building who had wanted nothing from him. 3 years. Not one request. Not one hint. Not one time staying after work so he would notice that she was still there. He said he had been afraid that if he opened his mouth and asked about the pen, everything would change, and she would become person number 401. He said he would rather not know than lose that. Outside, the rain kept falling over the lake, and no one turned on another light in the room. Massimo lifted his coat from the back of the chair, draped it over her shoulders, and held the two sides together for 1 second before letting go. The notice arrived on the afternoon of the 25th day, and it came so late that Kessler had to call the trust bank twice to confirm that it was still valid. Rocco Rinaldi had convened a meeting of the family council for 10 o'clock the following morning, in the upstairs room of the restaurant on Taylor Street, to consider confirmation of the heir to the escrowed block of shares held in the name of Angelo Ferraro. 10 o'clock in the morning on the 26th day, the final day. Adeline read the notice without showing any surprise, because she had said this would happen 16 days earlier in the LaSalle Street office, when she looked at the number 34 on Kessler's sheet of paper and understood that the man would let the clock run all the way down before stepping into the room. That night, Kessler called. He called a little before 11 o'clock, and his voice no longer had the dry, even cadence of a man reading results. He said the door to his office on LaSalle Street had been opened. When Massimo and Adeline arrived, the outer door hadn't been forced, the lock was intact, and the wall safe behind the file shelves stood wide open, its steel door hanging outward. Everything else inside remained untouched. The forensic reports, copies of the business registry searches, the bank records, all of it was exactly where it had been. Only one thing was missing: the 7 original contracts taken from archive number 7 at the harbor. Kessler stood beside the safe, still holding his key ring, and his face had gone pale in the way of a man who had worked for 32 years and had never lost a piece of evidence. He said he had high-resolution scans of all 7 pages. He had every measurement of pen pressure. He had his own signed and sealed report. Then he said the part that made all of those things meaningless. The family council didn't consider scans. It didn't consider reports. The rules of that dining room on Taylor Street had existed long before scanners did, and they accepted only original evidence laid on the table where all 14 people could see it together. Massimo understood immediately. He said his uncle hadn't taken them to destroy the evidence, because if destruction had been the goal, he would have burned the whole safe, taken everything. He had taken exactly 7 pages, exactly the pages that could be placed on the table, and left behind everything that couldn't. He didn't need them to disappear from the world. He only needed them not to be in that room at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Kessler said he was sorry, and he said it 3 times in 2 minutes. Massimo stood in front of the open safe, with one hand braced against the edge of the shelving, and began calculating what remained. Calculating who he could call in the next 11 hours, what he could buy, what he could move. Then he turned and looked at his wife. Adeline was standing a few steps away, staring directly into the empty safe, both hands in the pockets of her coat. She wasn't panicking. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't go pale, didn't start breathing faster, didn't step forward to check whether the 7 sheets had simply been moved to a lower compartment. She only stood there looking, calm as though she were looking at a table that had already been cleared. And Massimo, who had made his living reading people's faces since he was 18, looked at his wife for about 3 seconds and understood that she had been ahead of all of them for a very long time. He asked when she had planned to tell him. Adeline turned toward him and said after the meeting. He asked why. She said because, if she told him now, then tomorrow morning when his uncle walked into that room and looked at his face, he would read it. She said that man had been reading people for 61 years, and he was very good at it, and her entire plan only worked if until the very last minute he still believed he was winning. She said that if she told Massimo tonight, then tomorrow morning he would perform badly, not because he was bad at it, but because no one could convincingly perform the belief that they were going to lose once they already knew they were going to win. Kessler looked from one of them to the other and said nothing. Massimo stood motionless for a very long time in front of the open safe. Then he nodded once. Only once. And he didn't ask another question for the rest of that night. At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 26th day, 14 people sat around the walnut table in the upstairs room of the restaurant on Taylor Street, and the door was locked from the inside. This wasn't a courtroom with a clerk taking minutes. There were no lawyers, no oaths. Nothing was written down. but it had one law that everyone in the room had grown up with: that anyone who brought an accusation to this table and failed to prove it lost everything and would never sit here again. Rocco Rinaldi opened the meeting. He stood, thanked everyone for coming, and proposed 2 things. First, that the inheritance status of the woman sitting beside his nephew be rejected on the grounds that she had entered the organization under a false last name and concealed her identity for 3 years. Second, that Massimo Rinaldi's authority to lead be reconsidered. Then he placed 17 pages on the table and said that she had entered and left a federal building on South Dearborn Avenue 11 times over 14 months, and that the person she had met was an agent named Naomi Vance. Chairs shifted around the room. Massimo stood up. He carried no papers. He said yes, and he said it plainly, without evasion, that his wife had been in contact with a federal office for 14 months, that she had given them 3 things related to 3 fictitious entities, and not one line beyond that, and that she had ended contact herself 8 months earlier, after being asked to record conversations inside the building. The room went still. Then Massimo said he had only one question for his uncle, and he asked it very quietly. "How long have you known who she is?" Rocco answered that he had known since the previous week, when the file was placed in his hands. He answered quickly, and he missed by 1 beat. Exactly the kind of beat a 61-year-old man accustomed to controlling every word wasn't allowed to miss. Adeline stood and placed the stack of 36 pay statements on the table, stapled at the corner, and told everyone to read the approval box at the bottom of the page. She said this deduction agreement required her to repay an amount that no court had ever entered a judgment for. She said it had been signed in the 4th month after she began working there, which meant 3 years ago, not the previous week. She said no human resources department could have approved a document like that, and there were only 3 characters in the approval box. The page was passed from hand to hand around the table. No one spoke. Then a chair scraped back at the far end of the room, and Bianca Castellano stood. Her father reached out to stop her, and she removed his hand. She said she had come to the 41st floor 11 times in 3 years, and every time she had come to meet the same person, and that person had always told her the same thing, that the arrangement between the 2 families had been planned for a long time, that the boy needed time, that all she had to do was be patient. She said not one of those 11 visits had ever been entered into the company calendar. She said it had taken her 3 years to understand that a man who genuinely intended to marry his nephew into another family would want the entire building to see it, while the only person who needed every trace erased was someone who had never intended to keep his promise. Then she looked around the table and said, "He didn't need me as his nephew's wife. He only needed my father's vote." She sat down and said the final sentence to the tabletop, rather than to anyone in particular. "I'm not standing here because of her. I'm standing here because I was sold too." Rocco Rinaldi's expression still didn't change. He waited for the room to settle, then said very calmly that everything they had just heard was testimony. He said he was being accused of forging 7 contracts, and he asked whether anyone in the room had seen a single original. He said this table considered only original evidence, and then he waited. Adeline said that was correct. No one had seen them, because the previous night they had been taken from the safe in an office on LaSalle Street. Then she said the rest. She said that on the 9th day, when Mr. Kessler discovered that the final 2 contracts had been signed after her father's death, she had taken certified copies for their records that same afternoon and delivered all 7 original contracts directly to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois for secure custody. She said the originals had been kept safely in federal hands from that day forward. She said what had been sitting in Mr. Kessler's safe for the past 17 days was merely a set of stamped, marked copies, and that Rocco had just spent an entire night committing burglary to steal worthless paper. Rocco Rinaldi opened his mouth, then said nothing, and Adeline delivered the final line. She said that office had installed cameras beginning on the 9th day, and the opening of the safe the previous night had been fully recorded. She said, "You won't be prosecuted for what happened 10 years ago, sir, because that still has to go through a great many procedures. You're being prosecuted for last night." The council voted in 4 minutes. Adeline Ferraro Rinaldi's status as heir was confirmed 1 hour and 32 minutes before the deadline, and immediately afterward, the 14 people in the room voted to permanently expel the man who had brought an accusation to this table and failed to prove it. One by one, people stood and walked out, and no one shook his hand. Rocco Rinaldi remained alone beside the walnut table where he had controlled that entire room for more than 20 years. Both hands braced against its surface, and after 10 years he had nothing left in his hands except a criminal case that was about to bear his name. 4 months later, Rocco Rinaldi's case was still awaiting trial in federal court. All accounts and assets in his name had been frozen since the second week, and the trust registered in Delaware had been shut down by court order, along with the 3 accounts at the suburban branch. In the lobby of the Rinaldi Holdings building, there was a bronze plaque bearing the names of people who had worked there for more than 10 years, and Angelo Ferraro's name had been removed from that plaque in the winter, 10 years earlier. They put it back on a Tuesday morning without any ceremony, just one workman and a ladder, and Adeline stood in the lobby watching until he tightened the final screw. The 40% of her wages that had been deducted over 3 years was repaid in full, with interest, and she didn't keep a single dollar. She transferred all of it into a scholarship fund named after her father, for people who worked during the day while studying accounting at night, because she said those were the people no one noticed, and the ones who stayed awake the latest. The first scholarship presentation took place in the courtyard of a community college on the south side of the city, on a bright sunny afternoon, with a lemonade table set beneath the shade of a tree, laughter in the air, and several children running in circles around their parents as they stood in line to receive their letters. And Adeline remained at the far end of the courtyard watching the entire time without giving a speech. The next morning, on the rooftop terrace of the apartment, Massimo made coffee for her, 2 cups, and he set hers down first before taking his seat. Then, he placed an old brass key on the table, small, its handle worn smooth. He said it was the key to her father's office at Archive No. 7 at the harbor, the little room at the end of the basement hallway that had been locked for 10 years, and he said he had spent 6 weeks searching for it among the belongings his uncle had left behind. Adeline picked up the key and said she already had every access code in that building. Massimo said, "Not this one." He said the others had been issued to her because she was his wife, but this one had belonged to her before he even knew she existed, and he was only returning it. Then he said the board was holding its first quarterly meeting the following week, and he wanted her to sit on it. He said he wasn't asking her to sit there because she had married him, and if that were the only reason, he wouldn't have opened his mouth. He said he was asking because, in that entire 41-story building, there wasn't anyone who could read a balance sheet the way she could, and it had taken him 18 days to understand something he should have understood, simply by lifting his head from his desk at some point during the previous 3 years. Adeline turned the key in her palm and said that morning he had burst into her office demanding a signature, and she had signed, and when she signed, she had thought she would get what she needed, and then disappear quietly from the city. Massimo said he had married a complete stranger out of fear, and it turned out he had never been so glad in his life to have been wrong. Adeline said he hadn't been completely wrong. He had still gotten the signature he wanted. It had simply come with more than the price he had paid for it. Massimo laughed, and it was the first time she had ever heard him laugh without something heavy sitting behind it. She sat there with the warm coffee cup in her hands, the brass key resting on the table between them, and she thought that truth didn't die with the person who carried it. It only waited for someone patient enough to dig it back out. For 10 years she had made coffee, wiped tables, scheduled meetings for people who looked at her as though she were a shadow passing through the hallway, and she had done all of those things properly, not because anyone was watching, but because she didn't know how to do them any other way. That simple decency had kept her standing straight until the day the truth needed someone to speak for it. She understood that dignity wasn't something other people granted us or took away from us with a piece of paper. It was something we managed to keep through the long years when no one was looking. And she understood one more thing, that she was staying in this home not because she had nowhere else to go, not because she had run out of choices. She was staying because she chose to. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you'll have more meaningful stories to listen to. How do you feel about Adeline's 10-year journey? And if you had been standing before that offer in the cemetery that morning, what would you have chosen? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.